For some of you, might be even morning, afternoon, whatever the case, wherever you're connecting from. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We're moving along on the book of Acts. That's where we have been now for several weeks. We obviously had made a couple of parentheses in the conversation, but tonight or today, we're continuing the conversation and we're in chapter 25. So if you have a copy of the scriptures, we would love for you to open the Bible because part of the uh, opportunity that we get to actually do it together is precisely to walk through books of the Bible. And in this case, we're in the book of Acts, and we have called in the past we have said that these are the acts of Jesus, and tonight is one of those perfect examples to illustrate that title or the understanding that this is basically Jesus reflecting, expressing, crystallizing his very own self as he has commissioned the church to really carry into the Great Commission, which in this case, we believe the Great Commission is precisely the proclamation, the expansion of the gospel. And by definition, the gospel is precisely the person and the work of Christ. How do I know this? Because tonight, as you see on the screen, we are in chapter 25, moving alongside through this latter part of the life of Paul. And specifically, when it comes to the title of When Justice Delays, now we get God's mission to advance. It almost sounds like a contradiction. Maybe it sounds a little off for some of us because we're so much of a linear thinkers. We love to see black and white, yes or no. But in reality, when you look at the scripture presents truth in many cases, in most cases, in this paradoxical, unresolved tension that definitely makes us uncomfortable. At least it does to me, because again, because my thinking is very linear, my thinking is through chronology, my thinking is to make very specific presuppositions, and I'm not implying that the Bible doesn't give us. Um, specific declarations or absolutes. All that I'm trying to tell you is that when you read the life of Paul, and as we see the progressiveness of the gospel through the missionary endeavors and journeys of Paul, we see this thing that potentially looks like a contradiction. And again, I'm speaking of when justice delays, and this is representing obviously the broken system, the broken world that we lived in. Yet God, it seems to me that God has chosen to utilize the brokenness of the world precisely to convey, to advance his mission, his plan, his redemptive plan for the world. And tonight is one of those perfect examples. Now, I mentioned earlier that we believe that this is precisely the acts of Jesus because what Paul is going to show us tonight, what he's going to remind us through his very own behavior, is precisely the behavior of Jesus. One of the things that we have said before is that doctrine is always relational. So, what we're going to see today in the engagement between Paul as a missionary, Paul as an apostle, Paul as a catalyst of the gospel and government, in my mind, I'm definitely, and I'll show you in just a second, I'm thinking of the engagement between Jesus and government. Now, if you were to go to the book of Romans, for instance, and you begin on that um, practical, and I say practical, but it's more of the imperatives of the book of Romans, which begins in chapter 12 and following, you're going to see precisely Paul setting up the pattern of how Christians engage with one another. I'm speaking of chapter 12. And then you get into Christians, how they engage with among themselves and culture. And then eventually it's Christians and government. Well, when you are in Acts chapter 25, you're seeing precisely the principles, the mandates, the imperatives that Paul is given to the Church of Rome. Now he gets to exemplify it. And all that I'm trying to tell you is whether it's Paul is speaking, preaching, teaching, bringing admonition to the conversation, ultimately, what Paul is doing in the rest of the apostles and the rest of the New Testament is precisely the expression, the crystallization, the application of the acts of Jesus. Now, one more principle before we jump into the chapter. The one thing that I want us to remind ourselves and think about in this when we describe the acts of Jesus is precisely that one of the tasks that I understand from the Bible when it comes to the apostles, when it comes to these human authors, that the author of the Bible, which is the Holy Spirit, chose is precisely to close the gap between what Jesus said and what Jesus meant. In reality, what really closes that gap is precisely the life of Jesus, not just the teachings of Jesus, but what he did based on what he said. But as you and I know, the life of Jesus on earth is limited in a sense of the years that he lived, when you think of 33 years, when you think of 3.5 years approximately of actual ministry, is limited. And all that I'm trying to say is that even when it comes to the geography where Jesus exercised and actually lived his ministry, all of that is again, it has to a limitation. And when you see someone like Paul that is going to take the gospel to Gentile world, when he's going to actually, and tonight is one of those nights that we can exemplify this, when he's actually going to take the gospel to government officials, when he is actually asking to go to Rome, this is something that Jesus was not able to do in the same manner. And all that I'm trying to say is that even though Jesus is the pinnacle, the climax of that closing of that gap between the words and the meaning of the words, because Jesus said it, but then Jesus also lived it, right? Is the way he lived based on what he said. Eventually, the apostles are going to take on that task. Now, the implication of my statement of closing that gap is that 2,000 years ago, um, you get this historical documents, you get the gospels, you get the epistles, you get you know even the book of Revelation. uh, One of the things that you're going to see as a common denominator for the church 2,000 years ago is precisely growing, developing that gap. And the church was willing to believe in Jesus, but they struggled to believe Jesus. The church was willing 2,000 years ago to believe and embrace the words of Christ as long as they felt the autonomy, the liberty, the whatever you might want to call it, the libertine to simply continue to perpetuate and choose that sense of uh, entitlement to say, well, this is what they mean based on whatever they lived. And you got to remember that the world is extremely diverse. The church was diverse for that matter. So if you think about chapter 25, which is going to give us a little glimpse, and I said a little glimpse, but chapter 25 is going to bring you a summary of what we call the kerygma, which is the preaching and the teaching of the apostles, which is precisely that very closing, bringing together the merger of the person of Jesus and the deeds or the works of Christ, which is that's what the gospel is. So one of the tasks that these individuals called the apostles, called the writers of the Bible, is precisely to document. And we see at least 8 of those sermons documented. We have studied through the book of Acts, precisely the teachings of Jesus through the preaching of the apostles. So tonight, because I think the issue is exactly the same today. I think your issue and my issue as Christians is precisely that our tendency is to embrace, is to celebrate, is to post them on Facebook, is to sing the songs and the words of Christ. We are all for Christ. And since we are very linear thinkers, we are very, again, we love statements. We love all these teachings of Christ as long as we get to define what they mean. Now, part of the issue, part of the challenge that you and I have today, and again, I'm speaking with a lot of biases, and I do recognize that, but I guess we all have them, is precisely that we are so driven by self as Christians. We're driven by our understanding of who we are. We're driven by our experiences that I believe at the very beginning of our relationship with Christ, that initial encounter with Christ, we were all in, understanding that regardless of our experiences, it is about the experience of Jesus. But something happens in the process, which we call this sanctification. Something happens after the initial experience in the process of Christ likeness and walking in Christ likeness, that for some reason that situation reverses. And instead of basing our decision making and our worldview in the experiences of Jesus, this is why Jesus couldn't just be born on Thursday, die on Friday, and then resurrected on Sunday. He also had to live, and he did, and he fulfilled every single requirement of the scriptures. We somehow something happens in the process that we start focusing on our experience. And eventually, I feel that like 2,000 years ago, we get to the place that our version of Christianity, or the version that we have of the person of Jesus, only works if Jesus, the Bible, Christianity affirms my experience, my feelings, my thinking, my processes, my background, my dreams and desires. Well, that sounds like prosperity gospel to me because that's not what the gospel is. The gospel is not about us. The gospel is not about our experiences. The gospel is exclusively based on the experience of Jesus. Whatever Jesus experienced, that's exactly what we have been called to experience, to manage, to steward, and to convey. This is about Jesus. So when you see Paul, again, dealing with a very broken, abusive, manipulative system, where there is the religion system, which are the people that typically are going to try to kill him. They are the one presenting the most severe and aggressive opposition to Paul. Or whether you're looking to a broken government, a broken governmental system, whatever the case you're facing, I'm speaking of Paul, whatever he's facing, if you notice, and we're going to see this in just a second, Paul is going to simply take every single opportunity, whether it's opposition, whether it's openness and attraction, or maybe friction, whatever the case may be. He focuses, he remains clearly very laser focused on the character and the person of Jesus. And I'm going to say this again. I think most of us, that's what we want. I think most of us, that's what we desire. But in reality, between what we know conceptually, cognitively, what we know theologically and doctrinally, we struggle to connect it with decision making. We struggle to connect it with ethical decisions. We struggle to connect it with lifestyle. And I think this is why we, as we study the book of Acts, we need the teaching and the preaching of the apostles. We must place ourselves under the authority of these individuals who were chosen by the author of the Bible, which is the Holy Spirit, to convey to us not only what happened, and we call this the prescriptive scenario. This is what happened. I'm sorry, the descripted, but also the prescripted, which is also what must happen today. So I think today is one of those perfect examples of the writer of Acts, which is Luke. He's going to give us historically the documentation of what happened. He's given us the narrative of what happened. But I believe the principles, the pattern, the lifestyle, and the way Paul is going to navigate what I just told you, a broken, abusive, manipulative religious system, and then also a broken governmental system. The way he navigates those things, I think, is the pattern for us to also deal with our daily experiences in a very broken world. So, again, if you have a Bible, I'd love for you guys to open up and just go to chapter 25. A couple of recommendations and suggestions that we give you on a weekly basis. And it's precisely for you to download the BLI Bible Lessons International app. This QR code allows you to, if you were to scan it, it's going to give you multiple options, but specifically, it's a link tree, what we call link tree. But it's basically the two options between an iPhone and Android. Typically, those are the devices where you can download the app, and love for you guys to utilize it and access tons of resources that you guys know we do offer through Free Bible Commentary, which is the website, freebiblecommentary.org, or Bible is International. So go to your device if you're not able to scan it, and please do that. One more thing that I'm going to invite you to do, and it's basically another QR code. It is for you to join our WhatsApp group. We have hundreds of people from all over the place, all over the world, literally, join the conversation via WhatsApp. And that's where we typically, on a daily basis, put a lot of resources for the church, and love for you guys to come and join the WhatsApp group. The last thing that I love for you guys to do and invite you is to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Free Bible Commentary. I have no idea how many videos are in there, but there are on the thousands. Thousands of videos are available for you on YouTube to utilize and to um, simply use them as resources for you to grow into your desire and your ability to know the scriptures. So please do that for us, if that's okay, in our conversation, our engagement that we do. What we do on a weekly basis, we invite you to look at the end of every chapter in the biblical exegetical commentaries from Dr. Bob. So if you were to look at the book of Acts in chapter 25, at the end of 25, we have what we call discussion questions. And what they do is they are thought provoking. Number one, they will stimulate your mind, because we are trying to avoid what is so prevalent today, which is mindless Christianity. We don't want that, right? In this case, this discussion questions are going to help us to see the overarching purpose of chapter 25. So, three quick questions that we're going to try to navigate and answer. Number one, why did the Jewish leaders fear and hate Paul? This is so crazy for me, because the fear and the hate, oh my goodness, this is oh, it's going to get really dramatic which by the way, this is 25, so that's what has been the normative experience, right? Opposition from the very same people that were supposed to engage to receive the gospel and really fulfill the promises is exactly the same people. I'm thinking of Romans 8, Romans 9, where the very same hardness of the heart is going to become the vehicle for God to expand the gospel into the nations. So in this case, why are these religious leaders fear and hate Paul? Let me make a quick parenthesis, and I'm come back to this when it comes to these religious leaders. I'm speaking of the Sanhedrin. I'm speaking of Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes. You guys know some of those, uh, you know, leadership elite groups within Jewish community. I get the impression sometimes, and I don't have a Bible reference for this. This is just my take on what I see in how Paul navigates again the missionary journeys and the engagement with the local churches and religious groups. I get the impression that one of the things that creates that fear slash hate between religious leaders and Paul is precisely because he was one of them. He knows exactly how these people think. He used to be a false teacher in a sense of Paul, being driven by his personal agenda, by his personal experience, by his culture, nationalism. I mean, you name it. I mean, he was a passionate brother. He still is, after conversion. But all that I'm trying to tell you is that if the driving force of life is going to be self, if the point of reference is my understanding, my theology, and I understand that our thinking has to be involved, this is why we're opposing mindless Christianity. You have to own, it has to be a personal experience, but that personal experience with Christ has to have a foundation and a reason. So you got to have a foundation and an object of your personal experience. What's the point? That if you don't have a foundation, which in this case is Christ, and you don't have an object, which is precisely the glory of God, then eventually person, the experience at a personal level becomes the epicenter, becomes the driving force of everything we do. Thus, this is why people sometimes ask the question, can I lose my salvation? I think that's a legit question. And this is not the time for us to discuss whether you lose salvation or no, but this is what I'm trying to say. When people ask questions like that, I am a little concerned that I feel that those questions are based on self. And I'm going to say it again. My understanding of the Bible is that when you are saved primarily from the wrath, from the justice, from the um, vengeance of God, right? So God saves you from self, first and foremost. The God who demanded justice provided the justifier. That's what you see at the cross. So you are saved from God. You are saved from hell, damnation. So we will never know the second death. That's what we're implying. So we're saved from hell. But the third thing, and this is what I'm implying by the whole concept of self, is that you are saved from self, because I'm going to argue that the number one threat to my own life is precisely myself. And this is why I think the work of Jesus is redemptive, is more than enough, and allows us to experience the fullness of life. Now, you and I know this, and I'll say this and I move to the next thing. Um, you and I know that when it comes to self, when it comes to the flesh, when it comes to, again, the egocentric mindset that we all are born with and we continue to perpetuate, is not killed, is not annihilated at conversion. I'm going to argue that conversion, that's where the fight actually begins. And I'm bringing this up because the initial response, the initial encounter with Christ must grow into a daily experience. We call this justification and sanctification. Initial response, continual response. So, this is why I think it's related to this concept of fear and hate when it comes to Paul. Number two, how does this chapter reflect one of Luke's purposes in writing Acts? We're going to navigate this. I think this is huge because when it comes to biblical interpretation, this is one of the key points on how to interpret the Bible. What is what we call authorial intent? He, in this case, the writer, Luke, is the only inspired individual in the whole dynamic of Bible interpretation and Bible study. So your experience, my background, and desires are legit, but they are not authority. It's what he said and what he meant. And that's why we typically say through expository preaching that we must read the text, we must explain the text, and then we have to apply the text. So this purpose has to do precisely with the explanation of the text. We have to deal with the text. I love Dr. Bob's phrase. Is one of my favorite phrases from him when he says that although as the Bible was written for us, it was not written to us. So you have to deal with that conversation on why did he write this. I'm speaking of the human author. Why did he write it? And then, when possible, when the original recipients can understand precisely the purpose of that writing. Number three is what was Paul's purpose in defending himself before Agrippa and Bernice. We're going to get to that at the end, but there is a reason why he's going to defend himself. And I love this conversation because uh, unavoidably, I think, as a pastor, that's what I know, that's what I do, that's who I am. And as a pastor, when you navigate ministry, it's a matter of time, you're going to find difficult situations. And I think one of the issues when it comes to pastoral ministry, when it comes to church health, when it comes to advancing the kingdom, is how do you navigate opposition? That has been the normative experience for Paul in the Church of Jesus, where there is internal opposition, meaning Paul walking into synagogues, and that's exactly what he typically finds: opposition from the Jewish community. Whether Paul is walking into uh, epicenter of culture, the marketplace, the entertainment industry, whatever he is, and now he's moving into governmental official. Whatever Paul is navigating those things, in my understanding, when you see how Paul once again moves through opposition, what you're going to see is number one, theology and doctrine. Because I'm going to say it again, doctrine is always relational. So how Christians deal with opposition, how Christian deals with simply one another, is going to reflect what we believe. And then this was going to reflect also, is going to reflect why we believe it. So not only what you believe, but why you believe it. Those things are going to come to the surface in the context of relationships, whether they are healthy relationships or whether they are dysfunctional relationships. Regardless, relationships are challenging by nature. They're beautiful, but they can also create a lot of grief in our lives. What's the point? The point is that how he navigates, specifically the opposition or the defense that he has to present before Agrippa and Berenice, this has to do not only what he believes, but how he exercises his worldview in the context of opposition, in the context of a lot of challenges. And I hope that as pastors, as we navigate and as we lead, as parents and grandparents, we navigate a broken world, we get some of these principles under our belt tonight. Acts 25 narrates the continuation of Paul's legal journey. It has begun in previous chapters 22, 23. He was warned in chapter 21 not to go to Jerusalem because he was going to find himself into this scenario. Not only opposition in a sense of theology and doctrine, not only the difference between worldviews, but now is moving into the understanding of legality, because ultimately the opposition has moved far away from simply just disagreement theologically. Now these religious leaders, they are in the same agenda, mission minded to kill this brother, because Paul has become an unstoppable force. Now, I don't take anything away from Paul. I think Paul was an amazing leader, preacher, I mean, evangelist, church planter, you call it. But here's the bottom line. The reason why Paul is unstoppable ultimately is because who he is serving, who he's preaching. And I believe, I'm more than convinced that if you were to speak of church planting, of church health, church revitalization, in my simple mindset, and I know this is way more than that, but to me, what creates precisely the stagnation or the decline of a church is the absence of the gospel. Once again, hear me say this, because I'm not criticizing and I'm not judging any of our pastors and churches who are struggling. And I'm not saying that they have become heretical or they have forsaken the gospel. All that I'm trying to say is that when I say the gospel, I'm implying that gospel presentation is always relational. It's always for the purpose of evangelism and discipleship. So you're always targeting those who are not Christians yet, and then those who need to behave like Christians because they are. So revitalization, church health, in my understanding, is precisely the reintroduction of what has been forgotten. And I believe what has been forgotten, and Paul is going to exemplify that, is precisely to bring it together as one single experience. What we believe must be reflected on how we do life. The more that we know the scriptures, the more that we go and actually execute, we become obedient. We go after the Great Commission. We go and actually do what Paul is showing us on how to navigate opposition. Tragically, in many cases or most cases, when or if we find opposition, we see a lot of us as pastors quitting. We see a lot of Christians simply giving up in their commitment or in their commissioning of why you became a Christian. What am I saying? That we make sanctification, We make Christ likeness optional. It's something that we put on hold, or we simply don't care anymore. So Christianity becomes potentially just a set of statements, propositions, theological, doctrinal, but has no impact and has nothing to do with obedience, with Christ likeness, with sacrificial experience, and especially when you find opposition, we are completely clueless. We have no idea how to navigate this. I have said it before, and I'm going to say it again, because when you look at books like Hebrews, James, First Peter, to me, those are some of the books that allows us to see the theology, the doctrine of evil and suffering. And it seems to me that in many cases, I am no one to minimize evil or suffering. But in many cases, I think what evil and suffering exposes is a generation of Christians, whether it was 2,000 years ago or today, that we did not have a biblical worldview of evil and suffering through the lenses of the scriptures. What am I saying? That we're pretty much bound, we are slaves of our own understanding. And when you face some of the most difficult challenges, experiences in life, and if your preconceived idea was precisely a different one from the Bible, you're going to feel disappointed. You're going to feel that you call upon the Lord and the Lord never delivered. When potentially it's exactly the same Lord that is using the challenges and difficulties to draw you back to Him. And what we see a lot of times is Christians moving away from Him, which is completely ironic. All that to say is that in this case, we're going to see how Paul navigates this legal journey, which is marked by political maneuvering and divine orchestration. Once again, the sovereignty of God comes into place again. Through Festus' administration and Agrippa's curiosity, speaking of two different governmental authorities, Paul is positioned to fulfill his mission of bearing witness to Christ. So here is one of those things that even though even though God may not approve what is taking place, he is going to use the reality that he's facing between Festus, which is again Roman Empire, Roman broken system, and then Agrippa's curiosity, which he's going to try to negotiate and come on the top, on the top of the whole conversation, meaning he becomes very people pleaser. Yet Paul is going to position to fulfill is positioned to fulfill his mission of bearing witness to Christ before rulers. He's going to take those broken systems, negative experiences as opportunities to fulfill the goal. So Paul has this goal very clear in his life, ultimately leading this journey to Rome. Now, let me make one more parenthesis. I got to move into the next thing because we're going to go into some of the theological insights when it comes to chapter 25. But let me say this opposition, whether it's from the religious leaders, whether it's from potentially churches who have negotiated the gospel and they have allowed the infiltration of corrupt gospel presentation, counterfeit gospel, false teachers, or whether it's the Roman Empire. So, religious leaders, broken churches, broken government, whatever the case may be, what this is going to expose, once again, is Paul's mission, Paul's call, very, very refined, very clear on what he has been called to be and do. So I'm going to come back again to what I said earlier. For the Christian, one of the reasons why we believe that we're saved from God, from hell, and from self is precisely because one of the things that we need to be saved from in the moment of salvation, we need to be saved from that distraction. We need to be saved from deviating and creating optional routes into our Christian life. So when you see Paul dealing with all this opposition, it seems to me that they become opportunities not to avoid them. It's not an opportunity just to simply to find identity or to find pleasure in opposition, because that's not what the Bible teaches. We're not looking for trouble, but the principle that the Bible constantly brings into the conversation of pursuing Christ likeness is that when the Christian moves towards that goal, towards that inheritance, which is a person, is Jesus, well, we're going to find ourselves into a lot of opposition and brokenness and things like that. But here's my point. The goal, the goal is never to avoid calamities. The goal is not to simply think that if you are on Team Jesus, life is going to make sense. The goal is that even though not everyone is going to suffer in the same manner, the call is that everyone or every Christian should be ready to suffer. That's what I'm trying to say. You must be ready to suffer if you are called upon to suffer. I put this concept of readiness for suffering in the same way that I see the second coming of Jesus. When it comes to the second coming of Jesus, it's obvious that no one knows when. And I don't think the point is the when. I think the point is that being ready when it happens. It is the concept of readiness. And how do you keep yourself ready? I guess that's the concept, or that's the question. How do you know that you're ready? Whether it's to receive the husband, to receive the shepherd, the pastor, I'm speaking of Jesus when he returns. How do you know that you're ready to receive Jesus if he were to come tonight? How do you know that? And then secondly, how do you know if you're ready to suffer? I think those are some of the questions that unavoidably most of us, either they're foreign to our understanding and we do not make the connection. So Paul is going to, through chapter 25, reminds us of this readiness. By the way, readiness is never accidental. And the lack of readiness is it is never accidental either. What's the point? That either you are moving to be ready, you are living a life of readiness, whether it's Jesus returning for the second time or whether it's encountering some of this never seen before, uh, you know, inconceivable, unthinkable experiences of difficulties and tragedies, whatever the case may be. The question is, how did you get ready? And I'm going to argue that Paul's pattern of preaching the gospel, remaining focused on the character and the person of Jesus, is definitely one of the ways that we are going to see whether we are ready or not. And by the way, just a quick thing on this. This is why, when it comes to the preaching of the gospel, this is why there is no way you can be ready as a Christian, as a young lady, as a young man, as an elderly person. There is no way you can be ready on your own. You must come into the community of believers called the local church, because it's the church that has been given the task to keep us ready through the preaching, through the exposition of the scriptures. Let's move into the theological and practical themes that we see through this chapter 25. Number one, the sovereignty of God is in legal proceedings. The sovereignty of God in the context of legal proceedings. So here, once again, this is not an either or, this is a both and. This is the sovereignty of God. This is God with ultimate authority using broken systems. Can I say that again? God's ultimate authority without approving what takes place in broken systems. He does have, because he's sovereign, he has the ability to use the things that potentially denied precisely the sovereignty of God. Despite human schemes, God's plan for Paul to testify in Rome unfolds through legal channels. Now, in my mind, because of what it says on the screen, I'm thinking of the authority of Paul. I'm thinking of his apostolic authority. I'm thinking of his ability to navigate really difficult things. Please hear me say this. I just, again, I'm reading between the lines. I think this is a biblical principle. I am convinced it's a biblical principle because of the person of Jesus. But I think Paul is exemplifying this. This is my point. When you see the person of Christ and you see the glory, the majesty, the oneness, the God who is one, three persons, you're gonna find this. This is, again, this is the dichotomy. This is the both end of the conversation. You're gonna find the God who is equal and subordinate at the same time. I know this is a mystery, right? But it's the God who is equal. It's one God. It's not two gods or three gods. It's one God, three persons, and they're equal, but simultaneously they are subordinate. And the point that I'm trying to make is in his subordination. I'm speaking of Jesus, subordinating himself, placing himself under the Father, is where Jesus finds authority. And it seems to me that's exactly what Paul is doing. Paul is navigating the broken systems that God instituted, but they're broken because they were given to broken vessel, which is us. So Paul is going to navigate the systems that God has established to demonstrate the power of God. So again, I'm thinking through the lenses of pastoral ministry, through the lenses of church polity, through church government, through church health and revitalization. We have to go through the proper channels. So I'll just give you an example. When it comes to church revitalization, for instance, when it comes to church health, one of the things that the revitalizer is called to do, and not just called, but you should desire this. Personally, I think this is one of the signs or one of the, uh, I guess, evidences that you are called to be a revitalizer is if you find pleasure. Now, hear me say this: find pleasure balancing and celebrating the nostalgia of a church and valuing the legacy of the church, and then hungry simultaneously for vision moving forward. So, in my mind, as a pastor, I'm called to place myself under the legacy of a church, obviously, the gospel. In other words, I just cannot simply come into the church as a new pastor or whatever. You don't have to be a new pastor and simply disregard everything that God has done in the life of the church, even though the church may find themselves in a struggling situation. You celebrate legacy for the purpose to look and create the future. And that's what I'm saying in the context of placing yourself under so you can have the authority to move forward. And I think that's exactly what Paul is doing. Paul is utilizing and placing himself under the system, whether it's religious systems and then governmental systems. He doesn't have to agree with them, but he follows those systems for the purpose to have the authority to preach the gospel. So I don't know. I don't know if that resonates with anybody, but I'm just thinking again in the context of where we are today in churches and life in general. Integrity in the face of false accusations. Once again, this sounds contradictory because here you have a generation of leaders that are accusing Paul falsification of things, counterfeit messages and experiences. And if you read the previous chapters, it's exactly what happened. How do you find authority when your authority and your credibility has been mishandled, has been abused? What do you do when you have invested of your life into ministry, family, work, and it seems that everything that you have done is perceived as pointless? No one values those things. Well, Paul maintains his innocence and utilizes his rights to navigate unjust circumstances. So I'm going to say this again. When it comes to, for instance, I'm just going to give you another example. I'm thinking of, again, revitalizers, church health, church growth, um, because it's done through the means that God has established, meaning his design, pastoral authority, pastoral leadership, and things like that. I'm thinking that the qualifications of a revitalizer, of a pastor, are primarily, almost exclusively based on character. Is who the individual is, not necessarily what the individual does. Now, obviously, the being and the doing are the two sides of one coin. So it's not an either or. But I'm just saying from biblical qualifications or description, what I see through the New Testament is only one of those qualifications has to do with action, with imperatives, with, again, with ability, which is the ability to preach and to teach the Bible. Everything else is based on character. What's the point? Here's my point. Since or if opposition in church growth, church revitalization, in life for that matter, for the Christian, opposition is normative. Have we gotten that? That's what I said earlier. I think the call in the Bible, when you read the book of Hebrews, the book of James, the entire New Testament, I think the issue with suffering is that the Christian is called to be ready. And one of the ways that you are ready to suffer is when you value character over ability. It's not that, again, it's not an either or, it's a both in. But you got to make sure that your abilities are built in character. I'm going to say this one more time because this is the act of Jesus. It's obvious that when you see the qualifications of pastors and deacons, when you see those qualifications for, in this case, for those people who are called to lead the church, we're describing the qualities of Jesus. That's the bottom line. I don't know if you guys agree with me, but the qualifications to be a pastor, to be a revitalizer, are the qualifications of the great shepherd, are the distinctiveness of who Jesus not only did, but who he is. And I'm gonna say it again. I believe that through that double transaction that happens at salvation, where we give our sin to Jesus and Jesus gives his righteousness to us, it seems to me that the call that comes from God and the qualifications that comes from Jesus, pastoral ministry, bottom line, is simply stewardship. To be a leader at home is the stewardship of the gifts, the stewardship of the character of someone else given to us. I think that's what we are going to give an account on that final day when it comes to leadership. Opportunities to witness the authorities. Here are the opportunities. And again, This is, see, Acts is not going to tell us, is not telling us that Paul saw as opportunity because the authorities were ideal, were friendly, were open, were seeking, were no, no, no. We just describe the brokenness, the craziness, the abusiveness, the bullying of these authorities. And in the context of opposition, Paul is going to see that as an opportunity. I again, we're not implying that Paul is condoning, Paul is in favor of what these authorities are doing. But Paul is focusing on being ready to suffer, and the readiness is not tolerance because he's going to present a defense. I'm going to say it again. Readiness in suffering is not tolerance. We're not called to tolerate brokenness and dysfunctionality and opposition. We're called to be proactive. And it seems to me that our proactivity, our readiness to suffer, it has to do by seeing, now listen to me, by seeing these challenges, this reality, this brokenness, the suffering. So we're not detaching from reality. Grief is real, depression is real, losses are real, death is real. But we see those things as opportunities to become witnesses. And you and I know from a legal perspective, a witness is somebody who is given a testimony of something that happened, of something that took place. Not necessarily, again, not necessarily your experience, nothing against with personal experiences, but the witnessing is about the person of Jesus. The moment that the focus comes into self is the moment that we start seeing authorities or systems as excuses to miss divine appointments. And specifically, when this is the issue and we see that this opposition as an obstacle, then we miss the opportunity to make a witness, to present a defense of who Jesus is and what Jesus did, which is the gospel. In this case, Paul's trials before Rome, the Roman officials and Jewish leaders become the stage, the platforms to proclaim not who he is, to proclaim not what he thinks, to proclaim not what happened to him, although those things are included, but that is not the driving force. The driving force is the gospel. And I'm here to remind us that the gospel is simply what God has done without Paul's help, without your help and my help. That's the gospel. And that's exactly what Paul is going to present. The last one has to do with the intersection of politics and religion. My goodness, can we talk about this for a second? The intersection, I love to put the word divine before intersection, but I'm not going to do that. But the intersection of politics and religion. The chapter 25 highlights the complex interplay between political motives and religious disputes. Does that sound like 2025? God help us. This is exactly where we are. And again, you and I know we approach the year 2025 in the year 2026 and whatever many years God give us and has given us, we approach the conversation always through the sovereignty of God, through the understanding that the God of the scripture basically has a divine, redemptive, eternal plan that has been entrusted and given to the church. Please hear me say this. This divine, eternal, redemptive plan is a person. His name is Jesus. He is the plan. Jesus became, Jesus literally is the announcement, is the gospel, is what we present. And I'm saying this because if or since everything moves according to his purposes, when we look at our context and the context 2,000 years ago, and we see that intersection between politics and between religion, between people who are extremely passionate about their Judaism or extremely passionate about their governmental position. Hear me say this. Nothing against passion, nothing against the things that people are driven by and the things that they are find, their identity. Please hear me say this. Christianity is way beyond passion, people. Christianity is about the passion of Christ. And the passion of Christ, as you know, is selflessness, is the God who chose not to consider equality with his heavenly Father. Remember, we spoke of that equality, but simultaneously, there is subordination. And I'm speaking of Jesus. This is the passion of Jesus, that he took everything that he had. Paul says in Corinthians that he, being rich, he chose to become poor. So for us in our lostness, in our poverty, we can become rich. So that's the passion of Jesus. That's the understanding that his authority is an authority in the context of submission, in the context of selflessness. And this is why I'm just telling you, this is about not necessarily just passion and commitment. Again, I'm not against those things, but there's got to be the result of. This is have to be about having the person of Christ as the foundation and the object of everything that we do. And I think that's exactly what we find in here. Festus succeeds Felix and faces Paul's case. So now we're moving down into the system, and he's got to deal with this is verses 1 through 5. And Festus arrives in Caesarea. We see the chronology of how Luke is going to document this. Let me make one parenthesis over this because I think this is important when it comes to the purpose. And one of the questions had to do with the purpose. Why is Luke narrating the way he is narrating the events and the characters? My understanding of the book of Acts is precisely the one of the reasons why Luke is going to write and document these events, including the sermons of the apostles, is precisely, listen to this, because he wants to convey to the government and to the world that Christianity is not a threat. Christianity is not against the government. We, today, as we speak, in a very, again, polarized, difficult season of our nation and nations around the world, we have an opportunity to remind the divine mandate or divine design of God when it comes to the relation between church and state. Both entities created by God and for God. And both entities, whether it's government or church, we have deviated. We're in trouble. Most of the trouble is self inflicted. And all that I'm trying to say is that when you see the writings, when you see documentation of these events, if you notice, Luke is going to speak positively towards these leaders. He's not going to sugarcoat the reality, but all that I'm trying to say is he writes about these governmental leaders and these governmental systems in a very honoring manner. Why? Because it's a reminder that we as Christians and churches, we do not expect for the government to behave like a church because it's not a church, but we expect for the government to behave like a government according to God's design. But it's obvious that before we expect and we preach and we demand those things from the government, we must clean our houses and we begin with self. This is why we're coming back to the whole understanding that as churches and Christians, this is what I mean by putting, fixing ourselves or cleaning house. We have to be ready to suffer because suffering, it seems to me, is one of the means that God uses for us to be shaped in the image of God. So we got to make sure that our suffering honors the Lord, and our suffering is a suffering that results out of the obedience to the Lord, not because we have to, but it's the obedience that we desire, and we get to obey Jesus Christ in a very opposing, in a very dysfunctional, broken system, whether it's, again, religious system, governmental systems, family nucleus, whatever the case may be. That's exactly what we're called to do and be. Well, in this regard, after 3 days, Festus travels from Caesarea to Jerusalem to establish relationships with Jewish leaders. Now, I'm not going to read all the verses, but here are some of, obviously, the verses to chapter 25 that make reference to this as he gets before Festus, and it's just narrating what I just gave you. So please check that on the Bible. You got to read the Bible. Jewish leaders present charges against Paul. So here we go. Here's the reason why. This is crunch time. This is Super Bowl Sunday. This is it. They're presenting the charges against Paul. The chief priests and Jewish leaders inform governmental officials, Roman governmental officials, on their accusations against Paul, requesting a transfer of Paul to Jerusalem. Their hidden agenda, here we go, this is the real deal, is to ambush, to kill Paul during the transfer. If you were to read verse 2, if you were to read verse 3, that's exactly what you're looking at. Is this people, watch this, because this is exactly the opposite of Christianity. They are submitting to the governmental system for personal agendas. When you see Jesus submitting to the Father, it's precisely to yield his agenda. When you see Paul serving, submitting to religious systems, when you see Paul, and by the way, when I say Paul submitting to religious systems, you go back to the previous verses, chapters, you're gonna remember that when one of the things that he's gonna be accused of, Paul is gonna be accused that he violated the law, that he's depreciating the law, that he is against the law, and eventually that he desecrated the temple. Now, look at me for a second. This is huge. For me, this is huge. What Paul is going to do in the freedom that he finds in the gospel is precisely to celebrate the legacy of Judaism. I said it earlier. When it comes to church revitalization, I think the revitalizer, the pastor, must have the ability given by the Holy Spirit through the scriptures to celebrate the legacy and even the nostalgia of the church for the purpose of creating the future, for the purpose of moving the church forward. All that I'm trying to tell you is that when Paul is accused of violating the law, which Roman officials care absolutely nothing about it, they don't care about religious practice for the Jewish community, but the Jews do. And the way Paul is going to navigate and is going to be sensitive to this people for the sake of their salvation, he's going to go back. And if anybody knew Judaism, is Paul. And he's going to go back and celebrate Judaism. And this is my point. Hear me say this. And this is why I'm coming back as a pastor to think of the concept and the ability of celebrating and endorsing and really being honest with the nostalgia of the church. Established churches find a lot of their identity in the nostalgia and what happened back in the day. And again, we just got to be careful that as we celebrate those things in the past is based on the certainty that we have as pastors and Christians on what God has called us to be. So this is not a funny thing. This is funny thing. This is not a dual phase. Non lack of honesty. You need to love the real church, not just the ideal church. You need to love the present church without approving everything that the church does, because obviously, and this is a two-way conversation, right? Because pastors, we're far away from being perfect. But all that I'm saying is that Paul is going to move into Judaism and go back into some of these practices for the purpose of open up opportunities for the gospel. Now, to me, this is huge again, because again, we are the result of those practices, traditions, and somewhere in the conversation, we got to come back to the gospel and remind ourselves that those practices were simply means to an end. And in this case, the end is the presentation of who Jesus is. So again, that's what he describes from verses 2 and 3. There's a special topic within the commentary for the Sanhedrin, this very select religious group that allows us to see what is it that they believe and why did they do what they do when it comes to Jesus, and especially when it comes to Paul. Festus declines the transfer request. He wants nothing to do with this. He's gonna reject it. And then he replies that Paul is being held in Caesarea and that he himself will be returning there shortly. He invites the accusers. This is a Roman official. He invites the accuser, this Sanhedrin, this elite group of religious leaders, to accompany him to Caesarea to present their case. So Festus is going to demonstrate Roman legal property by not yielding to the Jewish leaders. So again, he knows how to play the system for his advantage, but he's going to maintain the integrity of the judicial process. Again, verses 5 speak of this issue when he is conveying this message to the religious leaders. Paul's trial before Festus in Caesarea. Now, he convinces those religious leaders, and they're going to go, and they actually go to Caesarea, and now this is where they go into the trial. This is what religious leaders were hoping to utilize that system to get to their goal, which is basically the murdering, the killing of Paul. The accusations in Paul's defense. So here we go. This is where the drama unfolds and gets into the details. After a brief stay in Jerusalem, Festus returns to Caesarea and convenes the court the next day. Jewish leaders, they're going to present serious, even though they're false, but they're serious charges against Paul, which they cannot substantiate. And in this case, this is where now the falsification, the counterfeit accusations. Paul defends himself, asserting he has committed no offense against Jewish law, the temple, or Caesar. Verses 6, 7, and 8 is the narrative of this conversation, this back and forth, and this defense that Paul is presenting. If you were to look at the special topic of conscience, this is where Paul is going to appeal to the understanding that, hey, I know Greek philosophy is all about the conscience and the mind, but for me, that mind is merged with the spirit. It's not an either or. It's not the physical and the spiritual, or the visible and the invisible, but the clear consciousness. Again, we spoke of integrity, and when we think of pastoral qualifications, I'm going back into this understanding of not just who we are, but what we do simultaneously. So Festus proposes a trial in Jerusalem, and this is where they're seeking to gain favor with the Jews. Festus is trying to play the system again for his benefit. He's going to ask Paul if he is willing to go to Jerusalem for trial. Verse 9 is going to convey this message to the point that Paul's appeal to Caesar. So, even though Paul is going to yield to the request, but ultimately he is going to utilize, and again, I don't know if this is a good parenthesis for us to remind ourselves. What we're about to read on his appeal to go and see, to go before Caesar, this is what I'm going to come back to the same thing that I said earlier. This is the this is the result of avoiding mindless Christianity. We have to know what we believe, but we also have to know why we believe it. And as long as our preaching and teaching of the Bible continues to be based on moralistic messages that have to do with what we are called to do versus what Jesus has done, we're going to continue to perpetuate this mindset of mindless Christianity. All that I'm trying to say is that because opposition is normative in a broken world, because this is a Genesis 3 world, the issue most of the time, and I am not minimizing opposition, struggle, difficulties, grief, losses, and things like that. But the issue most of the time is when the Christian does not know what to do with the opposition and the conflict. And when you see Paul navigating this very direct accusations, false, but they're accusations. When you see people knowing how to navigate and manipulate the systems, Paul is fully capable to remain focused on what he's been called to do, and simultaneously, because of his centeredness and his decisiveness, not to deviate from the gospel, it gives you the freedom to utilize the broken systems so you can accomplish precisely the call. And this is why, when it comes to his, we're fixing to read this, when you see his citizenship as a Roman citizen, he knows how to utilize that for one purpose, and it's not self. The purpose is the conveying, the witnessing, the proclamation of one single individual. So here's the bottom line when it comes to gospel presentation. How is our preaching, our teaching of the Bible, training our generation to utilize everything that happens in this world, whether it's good, bad, or ugly, whatever happens in this world? How do we process? How are we training and equipping one another to really move into the reality of a broken environment and a broken generation for the sake of gospel expansion? That is the question that we have to ask ourselves, because that's exactly what's taking place in here. In other words, what I'm trying to tell you is this: Paul's Paul's processes, Paul's um, behavior and theology, which is one experience for him. What he believes and what he does with the belief system is not so he can avoid incarceration. The purpose is not so he can avoid eventually decapitation. He's gonna historically we know that he's gonna be decapitated. That's not the purpose, because that's self-serving. That's prosperity gospel. That if you believe is so you can have the best life now. That's not what the gospel is about. Paul, from day one, he was focused on gospel presentation, gospel expansion. So again, I'm just processing this through the task of marriage, parenting, grandparenting, pastoral leadership, broken families, dysfunctional contexts, difficult churches, whatever the case may be, and even in successful experiences. How do you remain focused? And I'm gonna say it again. You remain focused by placing yourself under the teaching and the authority of the scriptures, by making sure that when the gospel is presented, whether it's on an exposition way, meaning manner, and when it comes to the preaching, when it comes to the teaching of the Bible, we focus on the indicatives. We focus on what has been done, so now the church knows what to do. I'm gonna say it again. We present what has been done for the purpose to have clarity on what we're called to do. And that's exactly what Paul is modeling for us. Let me finish with this. Paul asserts his right to be tried at Caesar's tribunal. Once again, he's exercising those rights because it's not mindless Christianity. He knows exactly what he believes and he knows why he believes this, stating that he has done no wrong to the Jewish community. So he appeals to Caesar, exercising his right as a Roman citizen. Festus conferrs with his council and grants, well, I don't think he's got a choice. He has to grant the appeal. Paul's appeal to Caesar is a strategic move to ensure a fair trial and to fulfill his mission to testify in Rome, aligning with God's eternal, redemptive, providential plan. Folks, let me say this. Let me say this. Um, a lot of drama, a lot of craziness um, was taking place for the life of Paul in the church and the gospel. But it seems to me that we're the place right now. Again, I'm processing this because I think this is the world that we lived in, that you lived in and I lived in. Paul is at the point that when he was faithful in the little, now he's been entrusted with much. And here's my point. He dealt with this opposition from religious leaders in a manner that the opposition did not take him by surprise. So, once again, when it comes to suffering, as it is for the second coming of Jesus, the goal is not to know when Jesus is coming back, and the goal is not to avoid suffering or to avoid hell. That's not what Christianity is about. The goal is to be ready. So the opposition of these religious leaders simply expose and allow for Paul to demonstrate that he was ready to suffer. But the way God honors suffering is by making himself, of the Christian, is by making himself, God, accountable of the outcome. And if you notice, as Paul is navigating this crazy experience of opposition and life threatening and incarceration and limitation and putting behind bars and all this craziness, please hear me say this. Paul remains focused on the person of Jesus, that eventually those experiences become stepping stones into the goal. And he knew from day one. Now, look at this. Look at the bottom of the screen. Is to simply align with God's providential plan. This word providential, providence, is the sovereignty of God being exercised and crystallized for the well being of the Christian. But it seems to me that Paul has understood that the well being, listen to me, the well being for himself is the proclamation of the gospel in Rome at any cost, at any price. So it seems to me that part of this beautiful narrative and encounter of Paul with opposition and suffering and distress and craziness is that it refines or it aligns the concept of well being with the person of Jesus. And I'm saying this because tragically, for many of us, once again, we agree with Christ most of the time, as long as Jesus has the same definition of the things that we like to define. So, all that I'm trying to say is this, and this is a perfect example for me to illustrate. It seems to me that the opposition of religious leaders and even these governmental officials are simply the means on how God is going to demonstrate that evil and brokenness, suffering, serves the purposes of God. Because God established from the very beginning that Paul was going to be a witness of him. He was going to be a witness of the gospel in places that no one has ever entered before. And it seems to me that the God who establishes the mission, the God who determines the mission, also determines the means, how that mission is going to be accomplished. And the task for Paul and the task for you and I is precisely to simply tune in into the same worldview, the same definition of things, that in this case, as broken as it is, as difficult as it is, everything that Paul is facing is defining, is reshaping, and is fulfilling the task that he received from the very beginning. So for us, when it comes to this narrative, verse 10, verse 11, 12, describe everything that we just went through, and obviously this engagement with eventually you have appeal to Caesar you shall go. What does that mean? Well, he's going to see King Agrippa II and Bernice, which is the sister, and visit. They're going to come and visit Festus, verses 13 through 22. Agrippa and Bernice arrive in Caesarea. What are the implications? The King Agrippa and the sister Bernice visit Festus to pay their respects. Now you're going to find this in verse 13. So Festus is going to discuss this with Paul's case with Agrippa. Festus is going to explain the whole thing that we've just been talking about and gives the details of highlighting the lack of concrete charges against Paul. He mentions the dispute resolves around religious matters, particularly about their cert. I love this. He's just telling me, hey man, this is crazy for me. It's been just a lot of back and forth. And then ultimately, this is about a certain Jesus who Paul proclaimed is alive. I just don't know how to emphasize that when you get unchurched people and non-Christian people to see Jesus, I just again I don't know. I don't know how do we get to that place? Because if you think about it, if we go back to what I said earlier, if everything is about my safety, my predictability, my passion, my desires, what happened to me, what they did to me, what I'm hoping to do next, again, I just don't think that's what the gospel is about. I don't think the gospel opposes who we are necessarily, but at the same time, look at what these guys are saying without really knowing what they're saying. This is about this certain Jesus who Paul claims is alive. Lord have mercy. I just, as a father of three and now a grandfather of one, I'm far away from understanding how complex life is. And I know my kids and my family and my grandkid, definitely like any other family, we are as fragile and we are as exposed to anyone. And here's my point. How do we train a generation of men and women that when, not if, but when they find themselves in unprecedented experiences, when they find themselves at the crossroads of temptations, they're able to magnify, present, and process decision making through this Jesus who is alive? How do we get there? God help us. God help us. This is not an easy task, but obviously is doable because what Paul is reflecting is teaching us, is bringing into the conversation, must become normative. Well, Festus is going to admit his uncertainty in handling such religious disputes and informs Agrippa of Paul's appeal again to go to Caesar. Now, this whole concept of who Jesus is and how he is alive, this is what we call the kerygma. So there's a special topic called the kerygma on chapter 24 of the book of Acts, freebiblecommentary.org. And this is what we said earlier on the preaching and the teaching of the apostles. So what you're seeing here is basically this is the point of the conversation, is the message of the gospel. And obviously verses 14, verses 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 of the narrative all the way to 21 is going to describe this kerygma and remind this conversation between Agrippa and Festus. So Agrippa is going to express interest in hearing Paul. Again, this is just the orchestration, divine orchestration of the openness of the gospel. The preamble has been pretty crazy. Now we're getting to the place where he is presenting this interest. This is the openness. This is the work of the Holy Spirit through the means that he established, right? Agrippa expresses a desire to hear Paul personally. So Festus agrees to arrange a hearing the following day. And Agrippa's interest, once again, here's God's eternal redemptive plan. This is everything working for the purposes of God, is going to provide Paul with an opportunity to do what? To be free from accusation, to stop the bullying that he's been receiving, to have a more successful, quote unquote, successful ministry? No. Is going to come to the place where God is going to show how he makes himself responsible of the outcome when obedience is the driving force, when Christ likeness is the win. Look at how, again, I just don't know how to emphasize this. The point of the conversation for me is that Paul understanding of what the win is lines up with his calling and the character of Jesus. So when it comes to decision making, when it comes to success, when it comes to ministry, when it comes to parenting, the goal, the win, what we're looking for is men and women who line up with the definition of Jesus. If you want to know what Jesus thinks of life and experiences, look at his life. Look at the gospels. Look at the scriptures. Just look at the revelation of who Jesus is and what he did, because that's exactly what's happening. So in this case, He's going to see the opportunity. Paul is going to receive what he's been looking, asking, praying. Um, I mean, this is why he is an apostle, to have the opportunity to present the gospel to a broader audience, fulfilling his calling as a witness to kings. So if you were to read those verses between 22 and the following verses, we get to the closing by simply reminding ourselves that Paul presented before Agrippa and he's presented before the sister Bernice. And here's the formal hearing of this gospel. Paul is brought before Agrippa and Bernice and prominent men of the city in a ceremonial setting. Folks, this is no coincidence. This is not fate. This only happens because God established it and he also established the means. So you have an individual who is willing to receive the call and obey the call. Watch this, but also to be a part of the means on how this is going to happen. So, if you were to translate these principles into church revitalization, into parenting, into marriage, into studies, decision making, sexual activity, whatever the case may be, God has determined how things are supposed to be done. But the same God determines the means how they're supposed to be done. And I'm gonna remind us once again what God has established and the means on how to get to what He's established is a person. His name is Jesus Christ. That's the point that I'm trying to make. Everything evolves, everything revolves, everything comes out of the person of Christ. Christ likeness while we are on earth must be the driving force of everything that we do and everything that we are. We are the bride of Jesus. We are the people of God for the purpose of demonstrating, exposing, enlarging, presenting, incarnating the character of God. This is a task achieved in community. If you notice, but also to know the means on how the call is achieved, how the call is exercised. And I'm gonna say it once again. This is the book of Acts, which is the Acts of Jesus. And this process, this means, these encounters are exactly the encounters that Jesus faced. And I'm just telling you, Paul is the closest as a resemblance on how to navigate opposition. Why? Because the means for the Christian to achieve the call, to exercise the call, is precisely the person of Jesus. Jesus is available, Jesus is present, Jesus is sitting at the right hand of the Father, interceding, activating precisely what has been entrusted. 2025, God willing, next week. Up. Jesus, we pray for churches who are facing opposition, even as we pray and speak tonight for pastors that may find themselves